Wayne, what you think about this car?
What year is it?
1970 Monte Carlo.
Let's take a look at it. Okay, body seems to be pretty tight. Let's take a look at some of the lines. Okay. One of the things you want to do when you're looking at cars is either take a magnet with you. That way you can put the magnet on the body. And if it's Bondo in any spots, the magnet won't stick. Okay. Here's a little spot right here. And then you have to decide what it is you want to do with the car. That's a little loose. If you're going to do a total restoration, a lot of stuff that I'm telling you now is irrelevant because you're going to change it. So down here, you want to look like it might have been a little work done right here at the bottom. And that's a known spot for rust anyway. So usually you can tap a car and you can hear it. The sound change, you'll know it might be some Bondo someplace. See the sound change there from this? It's a different sound. So that's a known spot for rust and Bondo right here in these quarter panels. And then you can also see the change in the paint color. That's an indication that somebody painted this part and this looks more factory towards the front. Okay. And also right here on this line, you can see where it's been painted because the paint is overflowing the line. Bumpers seem to be pretty tight. You also, when you're looking at stuff, you can look at the seams, the lines on the car, compare the different sides. If one side got a smaller gap than the other, that's an indication the car may have been hit and shifted or something. So those are things to look out for. See, that's nice and solid there as compared to the other side. You can hear a difference. This side don't look like it, feel like it's been repaired. Little rust on the doors. Car 50 years old, you can expect that. Okay, so far so good. So the outside looks pretty good. So let's take a look at some of the stuff you want to be aware of on the inside, okay? Again, like the seats, if you plan on redoing the seats and all that's going to be changed, so that's really irrelevant. Okay, now, when you're in the car and you look at the dash and you look at the speedometer and the mileage, this one has 93,217 miles on it. Now, if you're wondering if that's the actual mileage on a lot of older cars, if you knew what you was doing, you could get up under there and change the mileage. So if you look at an older car and it has, say, 34,000 miles on it, take a look at the gas pedal and the brake pedal. If they look all worn out, then believe me, it's more than 34,000 miles on it. But in this case, they look like they got about 93,000 miles on it. The carpet's in good shape. The interior don't smell like rust or rot. So all in all, the interior looks good also. The headline isn't falling down. So that's a good sign. Okay, back to the 1970 Monte Carlo, looking pretty good. If you want to know something about the doors and the colors, if you look real close, you can see there's a difference in the original color and where they repainted this because they did some body work on it. Okay, and you can get down low and look at the bottom of the doors. And the reason you want to do this when you get ready to purchase a car is because you want to try to make the best deal possible. Okay, because anytime you're buying a car 50 years old, it's going to need some work. But a lot of times, even the owner doesn't know to what extent the work needs to be done unless you point it out to them. And maybe it'll give you a better deal. So looking in the trunk, you want to check for rust. This trunk looks original in here. And it looks pretty solid, just a little surface rust. So that's a good thing. Okay. Come around to the passenger side. Let's look at the door and the rocker arms. I think that's what they call it on this side. Looking pretty good. Of course, all the rubber is going to have to be replaced because it's 50 years old. Okay. Looking good. You can also pull up the carpet if it's loose. You don't want to be pulling up people's carpet if it isn't loose. And you can look at the floor pan. This is just surface rust. It's not all the way through. You can take like a screwdriver and see if you can stick it through. If you can't, then it's still solid. So this can be scraped off, sprayed with some rust inhibitor, and it'll be good, just as solid. Now we're gonna go down low. We up under the car now. Oh, looking good. I don't see any rust spots through. The frame looks pretty good. So all in all, the car was well kept. So let's take a look at the engine compartment now. What do I see here on the side? This is the hood hinge and spring. Spring looks fairly new, and the numbers on the side indicate that they probably got this piece out of a junkyard because something happened to the other piece. Either the mechanism was weak and the hood wasn't shutting good, or may have been an accident. But looking up under the car, the fender wells and stuff, I don't see any real indication that the front end was hit. You see a little crack in the fender wells, but that's normal on some cars. I see a little antifreeze on the intake right here. If you can see that antifreeze there. And that's probably coming from this hose right here, or either the housing. Because if you look close, you can see the blue on the gasket where they must have had it off at some point. And then we follow that hose over to here, and we can see a little leak on the radiator. So that could be coming from the hose, or it could be a pinhole in the radiator. Okay. We look at the power steering pumping hose. Those lines there look fairly new. So at some point they did some work on that. Let's pull the dipstick on the engine and the trans, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. Okay, we're gonna pull the dipstick on the engine. This is where you check your oil level. Okay, it can tell you a lot about how good a person maintains their car. This one look pretty clear. You can't even see it on the stick, which is a good sign. Sometimes you'll pull these out and they be dirty and just pitiful. But if you're gonna sell a car anyway, you should put new oil in it, because you know people gonna pull the dipstick. So okay, now we're gonna pull the transmission dipstick. And what you want to do with it is to see if there's any on there first. And also you want to smell it. Okay, you say, why are you smelling it? Well, you smell it because in a transmission you have pressure plates. And when those pressure plates get worn out and worn down, they have a burnt smell to them. So if you smell the transmission stick and the oil smell burnt, you know your trans is soon to go out. So it looks like you made a pretty good purchase. I don't know what you paid for the car, but the car seems to be pretty solid. Now the next question is what you want to do to it, how far you want to go on a restoration.
So how much you think it'll cost to do a full restore?
Okay. Well, frankly, a full restoration still depends on what you want to put in it. So let's just take it step by step and talk about a few items. Okay. With the engine by itself, you can, a lot of times you can take the engine out, rebuild it, put it back in. You can put it back in as stock with the stock horsepower, or you can have people put aftermarket parts in the engine that are booster horsepower, or you can actually buy what's called a crate engine. Now, crate engines come in a couple of different ways. You can do a short block, which is basically minus the intake, everything below that. It come with the heads, the pistons, the lifters, all that stuff, which would be the short block. Then you can do a long block, which would basically have everything on it, except sometimes the carburetor. You add your own carburetor distributor. Or you can do what's called a turnkey. Turnkey means you get it out the crate, hook up a couple of wires to your starter, to your ignition, turn the key, and it'll start up. So let's talk about price. Depending on how many horsepower you're talking about, you're usually talking about, say, what is it, $10 to $25 per horsepower. And what I mean by that is, if you wanted a small block 350, which would be bored out to 383, and you wanted 500 horsepower, At $10 a horsepower, that would be $5,000 for that engine. Okay, and then that depends on whether you do a short block or long block.
Should I consider a transmission at the time of purchasing my engine?
Good question. Let's look at it this way. The transmission, the engine, the drive shaft, and the rear end are all considered one piece. Look at it that way. Because if you upgrade the engine and don't upgrade any other part, then one of those other parts is guaranteed to fail, because it goes back to a chain. Wherever the weakest link is, that's what's going to give out. So I wouldn't even do one without doing the rest. Okay. Now let's talk about transmission for a second. This car has an automatic transmission in it. You could even put a 4-speed transmission in it, or 5-speed, or 6-speed with a clutch. That can be done to these cars. Or you can go back with an automatic transmission. Right now, the shifter is on the column, which you can see right here. A lot of people like to put the shifter on the floor, which you can actually buy a console or do a custom built console, put the shifter on the floor, have your radio built into the console. You can run the console all the way back to the back seat, have speakers in it. There's a lot of things you can do with these cars. But yes, you do need another transmission, because you figure this transmission is 50 years old. So that would be like giving a 50-year-old man a new heart and then tell him to go out there and run a marathon. Well, he still got 50-year-old legs and lungs and everything else still. 50 years old, so he might not make it. Okay. Now, speaking of the trans is connected to a drive shaft. So the drive shaft needs to be replaced, okay? Because you boosting a lot, you almost doubling the horsepower of this car. You had a question for?
Yes, I was considering swapping the engine out for a big block.
Okay, let's talk about doing a big block, okay? Now, what would be the reasoning, just questioning, why you would want to go to a big block? Is it for horsepower or looks, or why would you want to do a big block?
Yeah, so I was interested in more horsepower and speed.
Okay, more horsepower and speed. Okay. See, that's one of the questions you always have to ask yourself. What is your ultimate goal? When you say speed, are you going to be on the track racing a quarter mile? Or are you going to do an 1/8 mile track? Or are you just talking about speeding from light to light?
So this car is more a combination of aesthetics and street legal, so I'm not necessarily looking to take it to the track.
Okay, so now speed, the more horsepower, the more money, so you have to dig deep into your own soul in your pocket to see how much you're willing to spend, because the difference between a 500 horsepower engine and a 550 or 560 horsepower engine can be almost $2,000. Okay, so are you willing to spend an extra $2,000 just for 50 more horsepower that you'll probably never feel or use? Or back to the big block. This is a small block in here now, so everything in this car is set up for a small block. This engine shroud here is set up for a small block. The motor mounts are set up for a small block. Everything's set up for what's in here now. So when you change to a big block, a lot of that stuff's going to have to be changed. The exhaust system is set up for a small block, which you'll probably go with headers anyway. So a lot of things you have to consider. And then again, it always goes back to how much money you want to spend. When you go from a small block to a big block, you also add more weight to the front end of the car. Now, weight takes more horsepower to move it. So if you can make a car lighter, you can go just as fast with a lighter car as you could with a heavier car with more horsepower. So a lot of things to be considered, but by all means, this car will take a big block.
Are there any additional components that I need to consider, such as brakes, before dropping the engine in?
Okay. If I was doing a restoration on this car, it's a lot of things you need to consider. Of course, you have to update your braking system because you're adding a lot more horsepower. So you may want to do disc brakes all the way around, or just disc brakes in the front. Now, when you change the brakes, a lot of times your wheels won't fit, because a lot of the 14 and 15-inch rims won't allow you to put disc brakes on them. So you got to put bigger rims on, which I understand you was planning on doing anyway.
Yes.
So that's not really a problem. But yes, you want to update your braking system, new brake lines, new booster. And the reason why I changed the booster, because this booster is set up for drum brakes. And once you set up for disc brakes, it takes a different booster and a different regulator to control the amount of boost going to the front and back brakes. So now let's also talk about what else you would have to change on a car that's 50 years old. Okay. If it's 50 years old and you can see it, touch it, or feel it, it needs to be changed. That's the bottom line. These cars, like if you look right here, this is called a body mount. Okay. It's several body mounts on the car, on the frame. And that's where the body of the frame sits, the body of the car sits on the frame. So you don't want metal against metal, so they put some type of cushion in between there, or polyurethane, so when you hit bumps, it doesn't feel like you're riding in a cart. So the body mounts will need to be changed. Any rubber on the car, like around the windshield, under here, around the windows, all that needs to be changed. These tires look great, but guarantee you they probably outdated, because tires actually have an expiration date printed on it that lets you know that once it's past that expiration date, they dry rot it. Even if they've never been on the road, they could sit on the shelf and dry rot.
Hey Wayne, can we go back to the engine compartment?
Sure. What you want to know?
So I had one additional question. Considering the age of the car, are there any modifications that I need to consider for the firewall? Any changes that need to happen?
Okay, the firewall. Well, let's take a look. If you look here, this is actually the water spread for the windshield, and this old rubber, feel how brittle that is. It's actually broke. It's real. See how it just broke? It should have just bent. Mm-hmm. So, like I say, it's 50-year-old rubber, so all that rubber would need to be changed. Usually there's a grill that goes across there that keeps leaves and stuff out. That's something you might want to find to put back. It wouldn't be a bad idea when you take the engine out to have the engine compartment spray painted. Okay. Just to give it a nice look. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's the other thing with a big block. Sometimes, now this is sometimes, you may have to modify the firewall because of the size of the engine. If you can't push it forward, then you got to push it back. Okay. This engine, you got plenty of room forward. You just lose this shroud and probably go with a electric fan in the front. And that would free up all this space. Then you would need all this stuff. And then back to the engine. Right now, you have a pulley system on it. The belt goes across the alternator, the water pump, air conditioning unit. Now they got these fancy unit belts, one belt that go across everything, and all that can be chrome. So it depends on how far you want to take it. So back to the dollars and cents. So we talked about the engine could be anywhere from, let's say, $3,500 for a short block, up to $30,000 if you want a 1,000 horsepower engine. Now you're talking about tires. Tires and rims, again, personal preference. You could spend anywhere from $1,200 for tires and rims about this size, up to $12,000 if you want, depending on what rims and tires. You have custom rims and tires to put on. Okay. What you want to remember, the taller the tire or the rim, usually the shorter the tire. So if you put on like 24s, your rim is going to get wider, but your rubber is going to get smaller because it has to fit up under the car. Okay. The reason that's important, if you're driving in a city like Chicago where the potholes are everywhere, you may want to think twice about taking away a lot of rubber.